Join us August 21st for this month's Lunch and Learn with the Link, focusing on chronic GVHD of the skin. Our guests will be Dr. Rachel Rosenstein of the Hackensack Meridian School of Medicine and Ann Fitzpatrick, an MDS survivor. This free webinar will be Wednesday, August 21st at noon Eastern. To register, visit nbmtlink.org or follow the link in our show notes. Welcome to Season 14 of the Marrow Masters podcast, brought to you by the National Bone Marrow Transplant Link and sponsored by Insight and Syndax. The National Bone Marrow Transplant Link, established in 1992, strives to help patients, caregivers, and families cope with the psychosocial challenges of bone marrow and stem cell transplant, from diagnosis through survivorship. This season focuses on chronic graft-versus-host disease, or GVHD. We'll cover male and female sexuality, the emotional struggles of the disease, and even atypical presentations of GVHD from the perspectives of patients, caregivers, and medical professionals. Here's your host, Executive Director of the NBMT Link, Peggy Burkhardt.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining us. So today we welcome a wonderful guest. Her name is Angie Giallourakis. So Angie is the mom, advocate, founder of a nonprofit called the Stephen G. Cancer Foundation, and the co-founder of Elephants and Tea, which many of you are familiar with. She's also caregiver to her son, Stephen. I'm going to let Angie share more about herself and Stephen's story with you now. Welcome, Angie.
Thank you, Peggy. I really appreciate you inviting me today to talk about my role as a caregiver and a little bit about my son, as well as our nonprofit.
Wonderful. So let's get started. Tell us about Stephen.
So Stephen has had quite a journey in the land of cancer. He was first diagnosed in 2006 with stage 4 osteosarcoma. And after many radiation treatments, chemotherapy and surgeries, he came out of that 10-month experience very well. And NED, no evidence of disease, and was doing very well. However, in 2008, he was diagnosed with secondary acute myelogenous leukemia, or AML. And in 2009, he had a bone marrow transplant.
Okay. Angie, share with us why Stephen needed a bone marrow transplant.
So what we were told by his physicians, that this was the only way to address this illness. Secondary AML is a very serious condition and it's life-threatening. And this was the only alternative for him.
Okay, that makes sense. Tell us about caring for Stephen as his mom, not just once, but as you mentioned, twice diagnosed. Talk about a long haul. We'll dig in about the GVHD later, but first I'd just love to hear more about your role as caregiver and mom.
Well, thanks for asking. You know, I needed to add one more piece to Stephen's journey with cancer. 10 years after his bone marrow transplant, he did have 2 additional tumors found in the area of his radiation. One was caused by the radiation, and the other one was, well, I don't really know. It was just there. So I wanted to add that. However, with the surgeries that he had in his backside, they were successful surgeries. And thus far, he's had no evidence of disease.
Oh, well, that is terrific news. Thank you for adding that.
Yes. So you had asked me to tell you a little bit about my role as a caregiver. So as with anyone who has parented a child with cancer, it is one's greatest nightmare and greatest fear. When Stephen was diagnosed the second time with secondary AML, we were completely shocked. We really didn't anticipate that this was going to happen, despite the fact that we were told that there was always that possibility that another cancer could return. And from what I learned after his bone marrow transplant, that this was not an uncommon result of treatments for osteosarcoma.
Okay.
So Stephen had his bone marrow transplant, as I said, in 2009. It was successful. And the time that we spent together in the hospital was very intense, and yet calm. I don't know how else to describe it. As a mom, I was very upset, and my husband was very distraught as well. However, one of the things that I focused on was staying in the present moment, because I knew that This was a long journey. It was a haul. We had absolutely no idea what to expect. We were told to just take it one day at a time, and I can assure you that that was what I did. In fact, I got to the point where I really didn't spend a lot of time talking about it with other people. I chose to keep quiet and just tell folks, just pray for him. Whenever anyone asked me, how's he doing? What can we do? I didn't want any advice. I just wanted to focus on my son and being there for him whenever I could or whenever he needed me.
That's exactly what you needed to do.
Yes, absolutely.
Angie, let's talk about stress management for caregivers. This is so important, and I know you have some wonderful thoughts on this. Talk to us about what you're passionate about and how it helped you.
Okay, so, stress management is critical in trying to get through being a caregiver. We focus on our children, but we are also focusing on ourselves as well, whether we realize it or not, because sometimes we're denying ourselves. We're not giving ourselves permission to relax or to find some peace of mind. And one of the things I suggest to people is to just find that one thing that you do that gives you a sense of peace. However, getting to that point where I could give that advice, I spent a lot of time reading and researching the subject of complementary medicine.
Okay.
From walking or exercising, we know that we're releasing stress from a physical level. And at some point, we're also releasing stress mentally, but not so much for me. Walking was about just getting it out and just releasing that physical tension. I also started doing some yoga to work on my breathing skills because that was really important to me, finding that inner peace and just getting myself exhausted, quite frankly. Nutrition is also so critical because when you're spending weeks in the hospital, you find yourself reaching for food that you probably shouldn't be eating. There was just that feeling that carbs were the only thing that would give us any sense of comfort.
Yeah.
Needless to say, we all gained a lot of weight while we were in the hospital, and that was kind of tough on us as well. And then meditation or prayer. And again, each person will pray or meditate in the way that they are most comfortable. But the whole goal of meditation or prayer is to find that place in your mind where you can see things with greater perspective. In other words, you're understanding what's happening around you, but you just need to relax the mind a little bit and find that point where you're not feeling as stressed out as possible. The other piece is that for me, as a person who regularly prays and as a churchgoer, I used prayer as my way of asking for help,
Okay.
I didn't ask this of anyone else. I just used that time for myself. I would light my candle in the morning and say my prayers, and I literally just handed it off to God. And again, this was my approach for doing that stress management. So a little bit about stress management. Stress management is unique to every person. And if a person doesn't know what to do to help themselves, it's important to ask people for help, to talk to your medical team, to reach out to professionals who are either teaching you how to exercise or how to find some mental sense of calm. And I know that social workers and psychologists on those medical teams in the hospitals have been trained to teach you how to meditate, how to breathe in a way that helps you find relaxation.
Good stuff. I know later on we'll share some of the things through your nonprofit that you offer. But for now, this season is about GVHD, and I do want to hit on that, what exactly Stephen's experience was and how you guys handled it.
Well, graft-versus-host is one of those experiences that we will never forget. Okay. And I did speak to my son about this prior to today's conversation. We were informed after his successful bone marrow transplant that there may be occasions when his body will experience some type of graft versus host. We were told that a little graft versus host is a good thing. And so we said, great, it's a good thing. But we had absolutely no idea what it was going to look like, how it would impact him or us. The type of graft versus host that Steve experienced were primarily in that first year, okay? He was, as I have told other people, he's one of the lucky ones, okay? Despite the fact that the experiences we had were traumatic at the time, looking back and meeting other folks that are suffering from graft versus host disease, he was one of the lucky ones. A few things happened. One of the most dramatic things happened within that time period, like 100 days after his bone marrow transplant. We were home. He woke up in the middle of the night and he said, "Mom, my head is swelling up." His salivary glands, apparently it had a reaction to the bone marrow transplant. So his salivary glands were swelling up and his entire face was swollen. And to give you a picture of what that looked like, think of Mr. Potato Head. And I told my son this not during the experience, but afterwards, that's what he looked like. He had lost his neck and his head was huge. It was incredibly frightening. And needless to say, we rushed to the hospital and it took a while for the docs to realize what was causing this. They were arguing over which medication to give him. In the meantime, Steve was saying, "Folks, I'm having a hard time swallowing. I'm having a hard time breathing." So they immediately gave him the Benadryl, high dose. And in fact, it did help and it relieved all that pressure that was happening in his body. It was a very rare experience. And according to his bone marrow transplant doctor, Dr. Cook, it has been shown in other research studies that there were reports of this type of a reaction, but very few, like maybe one or two that we knew of at that time in 2009.
Okay.
Other things that happened to Steve were within his digestive tract. He experienced C. diff.
Okay.
That was the best way to explain it. We had to rush to the hospital for that. It was a very frightening time as well. So after that, then he started experiencing some muscle pain, cramping, uncontrolled movements with his hands. And it was just, no one knew what was going on. We had discussions, the doctors were saying, no, it's neuropathy, due to the chemotherapy he's received. One person asked, do you think it's emotional? Do you think that some of this is just a mental thing, this pain that he's talking about? And finally, we were given an opportunity, which helped us tremendously. We were sent to the National Cancer Institute in Bethesda, Maryland, part of the NIH, the National Institutes of Health. And Steve participated in a historical study where folks that had bone marrow transplants were experiencing some aspect of pain or discomfort, and they were collecting the data. So every part of his body was tested. There were biopsies everywhere. And what they found was that in his fascia, the tissue that connects the muscle to the bone, and I'm not a doctor, so maybe saying that incorrectly, was inflamed. So throughout his body, his fascia was inflamed.
Okay.
And for nothing else but to know that we were validated, that he was validated, that this wasn't some type of psychological experience that he was having or that it was depression. It was something that was really happening to him. So those things really made a difference for us. But once we knew that, he knew that he could take some pain meds and find relief. Now, one more thing I wanted to add to this, and this is something that he and I talked about as well. Steve was 19 years old at that time when he was going through all of this. And he was trying to go back to school, back to college. However, he didn't take into account that college can be very fatiguing, that the stress of studying and whatnot is stressful on the body as well as the mind. And he had to drop out. He was having episodes of excruciating pain, and he found himself not wanting to do anything. And then the fatigue factor was tremendous. So with maturity and time, he realized that he needed to find more time to rest.
Okay.
And that it was okay. And that if he needed help, he would ask for it. He needed to change his diet. He needed to improve his diet. He needed to drink liquids, water. He needed to hydrate on a regular basis. Things that are fundamental, in trying to heal. But when you're speaking to an adolescent, it's like talking to a brick wall.
Mm-hmm.
So as a mother, I stood back and waited, okay? And because I have a background in counseling, one of the things I encouraged him to do, because I knew it would help him, would be to get into some kind of psychological therapy to help address the things that he was pushing back on, that he didn't want to do. Because I told him, you have a choice here. You have a life that you want to live, and you want to live it well. What are you going to do to help yourself? Because I can only do so much for you. You want to be independent of your family, but at the same time, every time something goes wrong, every time you don't feel well, I have to come running, which is okay. But, he was 19.
Exactly.
And he needed to realize some things. And it took a few years, of therapy and just growing up as a young man.
Wow, that is very powerful. And I know our listeners, this is so helpful to have you talk this way. And boy, Stephen has really gone from being a young man, very young man, to, just so many years of dealing with this and growing through the experience, and having you to guide him, I'm sure made a huge difference. Thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
So I know you took all of this know-how and gumption and passion, and you decided to start a foundation.
Yes.
So tell us how that happened.
So after his bone marrow transplant, I was sitting with one of his physicians in the hallway outside his room at the hospital. And I turned to him and I said, so if this all goes well and the bone marrow transplant works, does that mean that Stephen will never have cancer again? And he looked at me and said, no, that's not the case. And I cried, okay? I cried.
Sure.
Knowing that this could happen again. And he said to me, live each day, appreciate the day, embrace all that's happening in your life right now. So, of course, I understood where he was coming from. But as a mom, and as a person who had worked as an advocate for people with disabilities in my past life as a professional working person, I decided to start a nonprofit to get the word out that our young people are getting cancer, and people just don't know about that. It's something that I think, we take for granted. And the other piece to that is that we know statistically through research that young people, particularly teenagers and young adults, often ignore those early symptoms of an illness and then wait until it's too late, or that the type of treatment that they're going to need is going to be very intense and also life-threatening.
So you started the Stephen G. Cancer Foundation.
Yes.
What was your mission?
My mission initially was to create awareness and help with research, help with cancer research for children and adolescents and young adults, because the statistic that I was given was that the medication that teenagers were getting for osteosarcoma specifically, and even other types of cancers, hadn't changed since the 1970s.
Wow.
So imagine being told that in 2009. Okay.
I can't.
How many years have to go by? So I started reaching out, attending conferences so that I could learn as much as I could. And at that time, social media was kind of a baby. They were in the baby stage. So just getting information, you really had to do a lot of searches. And at that time, there was very little information out there. And I must also tell you that when we first started the foundation, I called it the Stephen G. AYA Cancer Research Fund, AYA standing for Adolescents and Young Adults. But in the last few years, we changed it to the Stephen G. Cancer Foundation. And I had added that AYA at the time, again, because I wanted to create awareness that adolescents and young adults were getting cancer at a much higher rate than they were 20 years beforehand. And even today, there's 80,000 young adults in the United States of America that get diagnosed every year, just from 19 to 29 years old. Think about the younger age group and how many more children are getting diagnosed with cancer.
Wow, what a wonderful thing you're doing. And I'm such a fan of Elephants and Tea. I can't wait to hear how that evolved as well.
So my husband and I have 3 sons, and our middle son is Nicholas. And Nick was working in the field of advertising and in media. And he had approached me 5 years ago, it's hard to believe, with the idea of starting a magazine by and for cancer patients. And at that time, and even today, there's nothing else out there. There was nothing else out there. So with the support of our family, our foundation, we said, yes, let's do this. So he went ahead and started talking to the people that create magazines. And then he and I went out and started doing some focus groups to talk to patients and caregivers, professional caregivers in the hospital setting, to learn what kind of information are we looking for here? Who is the voice of this magazine? And one of the things we kept hearing over and over again was this. The young adults did not want their material to be told by professionals. They wanted to tell their own story. They did not want to be edited. They wanted to have their voice heard. So we decided and we agreed upon a non-filtered magazine authored by young adult cancer patients.
Wonderful.
Also, caregivers do also write articles, and also people beyond the young adult age, because we know that many people in my age group, for example, are child cancer survivors. You know, it's not just about that initial experience, because cancer can stay with you in terms of the post-treatment effects throughout your life. So that's part of the story as well that we want to get out there.
The unfiltered part is phenomenal.
Yeah.
I've gone down the rabbit hole many a day. I'm working away and I get the newsletter or the magazine in my email inbox. And I say to myself, do you really want to do this right now? Because I literally could start reading.
Yeah.
I could sit there and read all day. The content is so authentic and so real. And we so appreciate what you do for, like you said, not only young adults, but there are limited resources for young adults. So to make this about them makes it very special.
Thank you for saying that. I also should add that Elephants and Tea does a lot more than just the magazine. And by the way, the magazine is free. You should know that. It's free to anyone who is interested in receiving a hard copy. And of course, the online copies are also free. I wanted to add that one of the things that Nick has done is to hire folks that are experts in their area. So we have editors, and we also have a social worker on board. And so she's been involved in the psychosocial support aspects of what we do. We have writing workshops, online and in person. They have gone to hospitals throughout the United States to do these workshops. We have magazine release events now, quarterly, so that with each paper magazine or hard copy that gets put out there, we give an opportunity to locate the event at a specific location with the support of maybe pharmaceutical companies and also hospitals in the area, to invite their patients and to invite the individuals that have written for that particular magazine. The individuals are coming throughout the country as well to read their story, and our foundation supports their transportation to get to where they need to be. You know, we pay for their experience as well.
Wonderful. Oh my goodness. So Angie, you have so much experience for the long haul too. You said so much, but is there anything else for someone just at the beginning of the journey? They're just getting started. They perhaps feel a little lost. anything else to add? Because you did cover quite a bit already.
Yeah. So I think it's important for the caregiver to not only understand what graft-versus-host is, but also communicate with the medical team, with your loved one, about how to prepare for those unexpected moments. It's also important as a caregiver to give yourself time to heal emotionally from the entire experience of having your loved one go through the preparation and the bone marrow transplant itself. We know that a bone marrow transplant doesn't seem like a really big deal medically in the hospital room as the bone marrow is being infused into the individual. That's the smallest part of the entire experience. It's what's happening before and after the transplant that is the emotionally draining part of graft-versus-host disease. For example, I was asked shortly after my son's bone marrow transplant to be a support parent to other people who had a child that had a bone marrow transplant. And my response was, I don't know what I'm going through yet. How can I possibly know how to help another person? And so understanding the severity of a possible graft-versus-host experience, of whether it's a chronic one or a severe one, is really critical.
Mm-hmm.
It's also important to take into consideration the age of the person that you're caring for. One of the things that I tell people, especially if they're working with teenagers or young adults, and your relationship with your child or young adult could vary from one individual to the next, is to try to communicate the best you can with them and to be honest with them and say, I'm here to help you, but I don't want to overstep my bounds. I'm your mother. Mm-hmm. I'm your caregiver. Communication is so important on so many levels. And if you don't know how to communicate with your loved one, then get help, because it will make your experience so much better. It'll reduce stress. You won't spend time thinking to yourself, oh, I should have said this to him, or why did he talk to me that way? Things like that. So be mindful of the fact that you are two separate human beings in this room together going through this. He or she is dealing with what they're dealing with, and then you're dealing with what you're dealing with. Having to drop everything to rush your loved one to the hospital or to ride in an ambulance with them is incredibly stressful and exhausting, because usually it's in the middle of the night. And, you just have to be mindful of the fact that you're going to need some help somewhere along the way. And it's okay. It's okay to ask for help. I can't begin to stress that enough. And it's also okay to accept help from your friends and your family. Don't be afraid to ask for help. You can't get through this experience just saying, well, it's business as usual. It's not business as usual. I'm going to give you one funny story. So I had gone to work out, and I was on a bicycle, one of those motorized bikes, and I had my cell phone in front of me because I never know when my son is going to reach out to me. And I get a text from someone that I thought was my son, and they said, I'm in the ER. And I flipped out. And I said, why? What's wrong with you? And they started to explain to me what was happening. And then I realized, wait a minute, this isn't my son. Who is this? It was one of my students, because at that time I was teaching again. I had gone back to teaching at the university, and I went, oh gosh, holy cow. They just scared the daylights out of me.
Oh, wow.
Just to give you an appreciation for the level of stress that one goes through, even while they're riding a bicycle in a gym. Okay? So really, don't be afraid to ask for help. And if you're a man listening to this, sorry, fellas, you are often those wonderful human beings that don't ask for help. You kind of just move through things. You move through life. everyone needs a little help sometimes. Now, sometimes people also need medication. And I'm saying this because I'm on medication. I'm on anti-anxiety medication because my level of stress gets really high. And I've learned this about myself. And I know that I need to calm down so that I'm not overreacting. And again, everyone's different. We're all different human beings. So we have to be mindful of how we're handling the situation.
Oh, Angie, I can't thank you enough. This is so honest and real, and it's going to help so many people. As we wrap things up, I just wanted you to share the wonderful resources that you have on your foundation website, maybe a little bit about the wellness gifts. And I believe you maybe do yoga classes.
I do meditation classes.
Okay.
Yoga Nidra. It's called Yoga Nidra. So when you asked about the different types of services that the organization provides, it's about support. It's about community support. Back in 2010, I started the wellness kits because one of the things that I observed is that young adults and older teenagers really don't care about stuffed animals. And I say that in a tongue-in-cheek way, but little children, they need those little fluffy animals. But young adults, it's just not the most exciting thing in their life. In addition to that, wellness kits were about touching on all the various aspects of healing, okay? So I included eye pillows for meditation that you could pop in the refrigerator, and if you have a headache, you can stick on your forehead. My sister-in-law makes those. I included a little battery-operated votive candle, essential oils that are donated to us from doTERRA, magazine, of course, reading material, coloring books, pens, a knit hat, a pill box, just things that from the mundane and boring, like a pill box, which anyone who's had graft-versus-host disease or has had a bone marrow transplant knows just how big of a pill box you really do need. I was told that by a social worker that said, hey, how about throwing in a pill box in there? So there's a variety of materials that just, as one person put it, boy, I really needed all this stuff and I didn't realize that I did. Okay. So that was the first thing we put together.
Awesome.
Once the magazine started, Nick was planning on, sending out the magazine, and then COVID hit. So he decided to do a Friday night get together. And this was during COVID. So imagine all these young adults hanging out, stuck at home, can't go anywhere because they're on treatment or they just finished treatment. And they just started getting together in that way. And so Nick would get on and we'd do a Zoom session and we'd all be saying hi to each other and joking. And it was a very lighthearted approach. Through that became a very deep and wonderful community of people who knew we were there, okay? Next thing we do is the healing and writing workshops. We have a book that we distribute to patients that was created by Elephants and Tea. And so they have an opportunity to hang on to this book after the writing workshop. We have a camp program that we team up with a group out of Pittsburgh. It's in September, the first weekend in September. We have camp. So imagine a bunch of young adults, again, coming to the camp and knowing that there's going to be activities that are things that they can do. Or if they just want to hang out and do absolutely nothing, they can do that as well. We always have a medical team available and social workers available as well.
Oh, Angie.
We recently started a program for individuals who feel an emotional need to have support, like in a therapeutic group environment. So again, it's about social support because we know that without social support, our patients and our survivors are coming out of the hospital and, quite frankly, not knowing what's next. We have accumulated a tremendous amount of resources that are available on the website and also in the back of the magazine. The magazine itself is a therapy session in and of itself.
Yes.
The stories that are told. Once a year, we have a Dear Cancer magazine where people can really say what they have to say about their experience with cancer.
Yes.
They also started with the help of a physician at MD Anderson, the AYA Power, and that is for professionals. That is for the medical community to learn how to work with people that are in the AYA population with cancer.
Okay.
It's not a medical program. It's a social support program. It's teaching them about the psychosocial aspects of being a cancer patient and survivor. So critical, again, because again, you're talking about a population of humans who were in the middle of getting married, going to school, working on their own, living on their own. Some of them have absolutely no support whatsoever. Others have a lot of support. So just being aware that we're not talking about a population of people who have settled into their lives or they've raised their kids. This is a whole different group of people that their lives have now been forever changed.
Absolutely, Angie. Well, I can't thank you enough. And this has been so inspiring. In the show notes, we will include links to all of these fabulous programs and your foundation. As we wrap things up, is there any final words?
Other than to say thank you very much for this opportunity, I also want to just, again, encourage folks, ask questions, reach out to organizations like yours. I've shared your information with other people. Read as much as you can. And if you don't like reading, call people up on the telephone or watch a YouTube program. But get the help you need and know that you're not alone, that your experience isn't the only experience happening, that there are a lot of people out there going through the same thing that you're going through. And by talking to them, your experiences will be validated. And that is so critical to the healing process. I can't stress that enough.
Thank you, Angie. We really appreciate your time.
My pleasure, truthfully.
This has been the Marrow Masters podcast. If you know someone who would benefit from the information in our show, please share this episode with them. And don't miss future episodes of our show. Follow Marrow Masters for free on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you're listening right now. And to connect with the National Bone Marrow Transplant Link, visit nbmtlink.org or tap the link in our show notes.